Welcome to the GMAT Ninja Podcast. I'm Charles Bibelos. Today's guest is GMAT Ninja's own Erika Osherow. She's a certified mental performance coach who has worked with elite athletes and elite performers across disciplines, including professional football players, Division I college athletes, and West Point military cadets. She holds master's degrees in sports and performance psychology and exercise physiology, and she applies sports psychology techniques to test taking. So, Erika, where I want to start is when we talk about test anxiety, what we typically see from our students and from people we meet on YouTube, on GMAT Club, is we think something like 70% of GMAT test takers, GRE test takers, struggle enough with test anxiety for it to influence their performance. And one of the things we hear all the time is, no, I don't, there's no anxiety. I felt fine. And I think what people picture when they hear the term test anxiety is shaking and sweaty palms and something that feels like a panic attack. So I guess my first question for you is that what anxiety is, or how do you think about what anxiety is and what it really feels like and looks like?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And one of the things I think about is we think about these physical symptoms for test anxiety, right? The ones you just mentioned, headaches, maybe just this like heightened heart rate as well. But when it comes to the GMAT or just test taking in general, I think we see a lot more cognitive symptoms. And what I mean by that is we see these test takers come in and think that there's brain fogginess, or you're feeling like you can't have to reread the question over and over again and you're not getting to the correct answer, or inability to concentrate and slow down, or these I see this a lot with students too, of like negative comparisons. Their just mind is wrapped up in who I used to be or how I was as a test taker, or kind of who is also taking this exam, what those means are going to be for this exam, how do I stay within that range. And so I think a lot of this comes down to these more cognitive symptoms, which is interesting, right? Because we think about anxiety as this mind-body connection, physical and cognitive signs. And I think we do see both, but I think in a space that doesn't necessarily elicit physical performance per se, we're really starting to thinking about like the cognitive symptoms as well.
Okay, so I think what you're suggesting is so yes, there are people who are going to have some physical symptom of anxiety taking an exam, but it's more likely to be that feeling that, oh, wait a minute, all of my reading comp passages were just really hard today, or for some reason they were throwing me some weird math questions, or I don't know why it took me 7 minutes to read this paragraph. Is that more the kind of thing you see?
Yes, exactly. Or just like kind of difficulty actually pinpointing what is going on, and just feeling like, I know sometimes they're just, oh, I don't know what just happened. I don't even remember this exam. I just remember not feeling well, and can't also pinpoint the exact reason for a poor performance.
So before we go down the road, obviously lots to say about what you might do about it if you feel any of these things, and we'll get into all that stuff. But before we go there, is anxiety always a bad
Mm.
thing? I worry that somebody listening to this or watching this right now might be saying, "Oh no, maybe I have anxiety, and
Mhm.
that's bad. There's something wrong with me." Is that how you want people thinking?
Yeah, no, such a good distinction. I think a lot of times we hear the word anxiety and we're like thinking about our inside out character that's, jumping off the walls, which is true, right? We might be presenting in that way, but I like to think about anxiety really as a stress response, right? And stress isn't inherently bad. When we work out, it's a stressor to our body. When we do things that are above baseline, right, above resting state, that's a stress. So when we think about anxiety, right, we're on the upper end of the stress range. But really, we like to think about anxiety or stress as our body amping itself up to perform. And really, it's caring about performance. Our body activates, increases energy when we care deeply about what we're doing. So I really like to decrease this understanding that test anxiety is bad or there's something wrong with us, and really think about it as like our body might be just at a more activated state that is no longer helpful. And we need to think about ways to start to recognize or calm it down.
So when you think about anxiety or stress or
Mhm.
activation
Yeah.
as a positive thing until it becomes excessive, can you say a little bit about what you see in elite athletes? So since you've
Mhm.
coached elite college athletes, professional athletes, NFL players, are they showing up nervous to their matches and their games, to competition? Is it a little bit of nerves is where they want to be? Like what are they doing to dial that in? And
Yes.
what is considered the optimal level from kind of an athletic performance perspective?
Yeah. It's hard to pinpoint one exact range, right? Like this, that all across all athletes or across all performers, there's this range of optimal performance. But really, we like to think about that. What's your optimal range? And so I often like to have people think about, what are those butterflies in your stomach? When are you getting to that activated state? You're like, oof, I'm like feeling like I'm ready to go, and I could just start sprinting right now. And when does that like level of I'm ready to go, put me on the blocks to go sprint, turn into I'm shaking so much I can't actually get my footing right? Or in this test exam, when am I shaking so much I can't even hold a pencil? Or maybe it's not shakiness. When is my mind getting so going blank, or I just click that next question and I'm like, what am I even doing? What do I have to practice? And I think those moments of that shifting, and it's not one point in time. I think we ebb and flow in these optimal ranges, and it at different points in this exam. So I like to think about it as this kind of arc of what's optimal, what is to that point of like, hey, I'm no longer sticking to my game plan or my test performance plan. Um, it's kind of how I like to think about it.
And I guess before we get into the two broad categories of ways you might think about remedying test anxiety, a little bit more on the idea, this comparison to sports, since a lot of your background is
Mhm.
sports psychology techniques. Personally, and I have always thought that I'm unusual in this way. I've always approached test taking as a sport. And it's something I did as a kid where it's just like, oh, this is a game. This is just like playing baseball or soccer. And instead I'm filling in little bubbles on a test. Sure. That always helped me to approach it as a sport, as a game, as a competition, one I took seriously, but not too seriously. At the end of the day, it's a game. Can you say a little bit about, is that, am I being weird here, Erika? Is there anything in there that's helpful? And especially for people who have athletic backgrounds, is there something there that might help them to kind of tune in to what that optimal level of excitement, anxiety might be for them?
Yeah. Um, I think that's such a great question too. When we think about, I like to level the playing field, right? Like everyone taking this exam is a high performer. They were doing something to get into a business school, to get into a law school, to get into a higher education degree. That demands a level of optimization, a level of intensity, a level of thinking about things that is also different than, hey, I'm just going to do something and, do education and that's it. So I would first like to say you're already in this state of like, how do I optimize and get to this more elite level of education at least? So I think in that sense, the framing of this exam as a test or as something that challenges us is adaptive. I find a lot of students love it, and they're like, "Ooh, now that you've said you have your sport background, I want to relate this to when I was playing tennis or." When I was an athlete growing up, or maybe I wasn't an athlete, I was just into hobbies that I took really seriously. And so I like to think about this as this exam is a test, it's a challenge, it is something that we think can really bring out different aspects that requires different tools and strategies. And I like to also say that we can think about, test taking as a kind of sport where we want to get ourselves to that, coming back to your point of like we want to get ourselves to a level of optimization. How do we actually get ourselves in a pre-performance routine for the exam, a reset routine for the exam, and then a post-performance routine, so we can kind of chunk it the same way we think about a competition as well.
Okay, so you mentioned pre-performance, pre-game, in this
Yeah.
case, pre-exam routine,
Yeah.
reset routines. Say a little bit more about that as we start to get to, okay, if you're struggling with test anxiety or struggling with brain fog, even
Yeah.
if you don't feel anxious, let's get into some of the things that can actually help. And maybe we start with those three.
Yeah. So first thing I like to think about is like these exams are cognitively taxing. It's endurance, right? Like we can think about it as an endurance event, which you can equate to sport, or you can just equate to like this is requiring a lot of load for a longer duration of time. And so when I think about a pre-performance routine, I'm thinking about what are you doing before this exam that helps you get to your optimal state of functioning, right? So if we're thinking about, I know I'm one of those test takers who really trends on that direction of I'm getting to the point of this stress is no longer useful and it's turning into that more anxious profile of mental or physical symptoms. I like to think of, can we do something to relax ourselves and kind of create a lower baseline? I've seen test takers and athletes use music, right? Or we use the drive to the test center as a way to be our reset or distraction, nothing to do with the exam. I've seen athletes also think about, or test takers to use fuel, right? Like, how are we thinking about our nutrition just as much as, our mental capacity? And then when we think about mental, like kind of pre-performance stuff, I like to think about what are the thoughts going through your mind when you think about this exam? How are we kind of being really intentional, offensive before the exam has even happened, right? To think about what are the thoughts I want to fuel myself with before I can even, see the first question on the exam.
So say more about that. So
Yeah,
thoughts that you want. So
yeah,
I think so often when we're stressed about anything, right? Any performance thing, it might be a big presentation or an exam or a sports match, whatever it might be. I think the natural thing for a lot of people is to think about avoiding the bad thing.
mm,
Oh, my GMAT tutor told me not to make careless mistakes, so I'm going to go to the exam and I'm going to not make careless mistakes, for example. What does it mean to have positive thoughts, the things that you want to be thinking about?
yeah.
What does that look like for test taking?
Yes, I love the example of don't think about the pink elephant walking into the room right now. Whatever you do, don't think about a pink elephant. And the very thing our mind goes to is we think about the pink elephant, right? So, in those moments, right, the pre-performance routine moments, I like to really think about catching those don'ts or those shoulds, and really thinking about, can we start to train or reframe those as, what do I want to do instead? What do I actually, when I step into the exam room, I want to approach that first question with a sense of ease and a sense of confidence. And then maybe it's like, how do I do that? And kind of starting to ask those questions of, what do I want to do and how do I want to do it, can start to be a really helpful reframe for our thoughts, especially when our mind is going through the don'ts. I don't want to do this, or I don't want to do that. And also thinking about, is this helpful? Is thinking about what my thought process is going through helpful to me? And if it's not, there's probably another way we can think about it with a bunch of different strategies. But I think those broad ways we think about it is just like, is this helpful? Is it getting me towards what I want to be doing? And what exactly can this look like that I've already trained? Because confidence does come from our mental preparation, as well as how we're intentionally thinking and talking to ourselves moment of.
So when this difference between thinking about the don'ts versus thinking about the do's, the positive
Mhm.
things you might do.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that could look like a couple of things. It could
Mhm.
be something like positive self-talk,
Mhm.
where it's thinking confidently about how you're going to approach, let's say you're on the verbal section, how you're going to approach a reading comprehension passage, for example.
Yes.
It also sounds like that could be something that is more inside the test, right? That
Mhm.
your brain is going towards, for example, on reading comprehension, when we train students, and I'm sure many people watching or listening to this has heard me babble about this on YouTube videos. Here's a certain way we want you to do reading comprehension, and here's what we want you to focus on in each paragraph. And it's not very exciting, but it gives your brain something proactive to do.
Yeah.
So tell me if I have this wrong, Erica. It sounds like when you say not necessarily push out the negative thoughts, but instead of
Mhm.
fixating on don't screw up,
Mhm.
it's focus your energy on either a positive mindset for approaching those questions, or maybe something that's very tactical and mechanical,
Mhm.
which is your approach to that specific task on the test.
Yes. Yeah, and I like, I think we hear a lot in pop culture about, positive self-talk, just think positively to yourself. And really I like to reframe it as think helpful to yourself or productive to yourself. And yes, positive self-talk, absolutely. But I think there's a whole other side of self-talk we miss that is actually strategic, that is actually about technical strategies, things I want to be telling myself, make it back to sport when a batter gets into the box. Maybe they're thinking, I can hit a grand slam here, but maybe they don't believe that, right? So it's like, what do I need to have a really good hit? And so sometimes it's like that contact, contact to the ball. In this case, okay, I'm going through my steps. I know I'm crossing out the first wrong answer I see, and that's my first more productive self-talk I want to be having, rather than, I can do all these problems and that's great. And people just don't believe it.
So I've heard you talk in terms of sort of two broad approaches to test anxiety.
Yes.
And one is more cognitive, and it's
Mhm.
around this idea of, well, there's negative thoughts, there's distracting thoughts. That's often what we see in our students. They're trying to focus on that quant question that's in front of them. And instead, they're thinking about what score they need to get into Harvard. And they're thinking about the algorithm for the scoring. And they're thinking about how judgmental their coworker is going to be if they don't get all that stuff, all those things that have nothing to do with the task at hand. Cognitive side, I've also heard you talk about kind of the mindfulness side, So maybe we should take those one at a time. I guess,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about the cognitive piece and this idea of all of these distracting thoughts.
Yes. Love this question. And I love thinking about like, what do we do as a mental performance, if we're trying to train our mental performance, what do we do with this? And so I like to come back to this first grounding foundation that our thoughts influence how we feel and what we do, just as much as what we do is connected to how we think and how we feel. And all these things are kind of operating together in a nice, we think about it as the cognitive behavioral triangle, but taken out of the therapy context and more into the mental performance space or sport performance space is we can think about first this cognitive aspect. So let's approach thoughts are not always helpful. Thoughts aren't always facts, but they're here to be either reframed or thought about differently. So that's where we can kind of think about, okay, is what I'm saying to myself helpful? If it's not, let's kind of manipulate, change, engage, manage these thoughts differently. And that might look like reframing them. It might look like providing a different kind of cue for ourselves when these thoughts come up. It also might look like, can I actually question some of these thoughts and become like a lawyer to some of my thoughts that, that come into my brain? Is this helpful? Am I considering, am I replacing fact with, possibility? And so we can kind of think about thoughts and manipulate thoughts differently. The other side to this is more of this acceptance approach. Acceptance commitment therapy is where it comes from, but we're not doing therapy. We're really thinking about this more present moment engagement to manage our mindset. And so whether this kind of approach takes, whether neither thoughts are good nor bad, they're just these things that exist in our mind as the greatest meaning making machine of our whole body. And then we kind of say, okay, if thoughts just come and go and we can replace every negative thought with a more positive thought, then what if we just thought about thoughts as just existing and we don't really attach ourselves to those? And that's where kind of we take this approach of breathing or more present moment focus and these more diffusion techniques or thinking about thoughts as just kind of these fleeting moments in time. As a separate kind of way to thinking about this. And I say both of these things because I think they're both two tools in our toolbox that we can use interchangeably. And some students like to go down different routes depending on kind of their preference for dealing with thoughts or managing thoughts.
So I guess let's go a little deeper on that. The first
Yeah.
one, kind of the cognitive, the maybe challenging some of these negative thoughts or learning to reframe them. So if somebody's listening to this and going, yeah, this is what happens to me, and I lock up a little bit on the exam, and I know it's because I have all these extra thoughts in there. So what would their first step be, or what would you advise them to do to start addressing that? Is it something where do you need to go get therapy? What can you do about it, especially if you're budget strapped? What would you do
Yes.
to start dealing with that?
Yes. And so I think this is one thing we see is like everyone's really quick to be like, okay, what do I do? What is the strategy I can do? And there's a million and one strategies. They almost think that the strategies are not always the problem first, right? The first thing I like to kind of think about when it comes to this more cognitive approach is actually becoming most aware of the thoughts we're having. Oftentimes, we're not totally aware of how our mind starts to think until we're in that, oh crap moment. I've already, 5 questions in. I have no idea what I just answered. And now I'm panicked for time. And now the clock is really consuming my whole headspace. And so my first step in this is, can we become aware enough to just track our thoughts? What thoughts am I having? When are they happening? Can I catch some of those thoughts a little bit sooner so that then I can create some more options for myself? Is like, is this a thought I actually even want to change? Sometimes the function of the thought is actually useful and it was helpful, but the progression of that same thought when it wasn't kind of focused on in that moment becomes kind of the downstream effect of now we're in that spiral of no longer getting to it. So all that said, I want us to think about like, what thoughts am I having? Can I become more aware of those thoughts on that side?
So the process of developing awareness around this, what we see a lot from students is they see a gap in their performance, and it's a gap between practice and the actual exam, or sometimes between practice problems and a practice test, sometimes between practice test and the actual exam. Somewhere in there, they go, wait a minute, as I get to something that is the exam or is more exam-like, I perform worse. And they go, okay, something's going on. The gap that I see people struggling to bridge more often is, okay, something's going on that I'm performing differently. I'm thinking differently. Things feel more difficult. I have the brain fog. how do they start to notice those thoughts in there?
Mhm.
Sometimes as we might develop a relationship with a student, we keep asking questions about how they're feeling and get them to open up. They'll say, "Oh, this is the specific one I have," but I think it's really hard for some people to get to that.
Mhm.
So I guess what would you advise people to do? Is it in the moment when they're taking a test where they maybe you should pause and think about what that is? Is it afterwards reflecting on it? How can they start to get at those thoughts
Yeah.
and figure out what they are?
I think the first step though is I always like to say, don't start anything new when you're first taking an exam or you're sitting for the actual exam. So this is really kind of we're thinking about the offensive, proactive side to our mental performance, which starts in the sets, in the reps. If we're thinking about this like as a strength coach for your mind, right? We want to think about how can we get the reps in ahead of time. So that's something I like to be flexible in. Some students really have time and like pausing, although that's not something we necessarily want to equate to in test taking strategy. We kind of have a little sheet and we'll go through like, okay, these are the thoughts I'm having during the exam. They'll just write them down while they're in their problem sets. But oftentimes this looks like test takers just writing down their thoughts after their problem set. Hey, this is how I'm feeling after. Maybe I'm catching those thoughts post hoc. Totally okay. You know, it's sometimes hard to capture them in the moment. But my whole idea that I try to train is can we foster some kind of self awareness of like, I'm not just taking this exam. I'm taking this exam with an extra focus of like, what is my actual internal process like? That's different than the internal strategic process. It's the internal process of what are all these stories I'm starting to tell myself about this exam as I'm taking it.
And I guess if we pivot to the second part, so we have the
Yeah.
cognitive type approach, and then there's the mindfulness, the focus based approach.
Yeah.
When a lot of people hear the term mindfulness, they think, "Oh, I'm going to go meditate."
Yes.
And there's research that
Mhm.
shows that meditation is can be positive for your test taking. It helps working memory. There's a study that was done that showed it can actually improve your GRE performance. So meditation, good. But is that when you say mindfulness or when you say focus? Are we telling people to go spend some time meditating, or what are their steps to start
Yeah.
incorporating that into their test taking?
Yeah, sure. Power to you if you want to start that practice of meditation, great. But I think that is a big myth of that mindfulness equates to this 10-minute, I have to have 10 minutes to close my eyes and be totally silent. And that's really not what, at least in the field of performance psychology, we really focus mindfulness on. Mindfulness is really the shifting of attention. And so when I think about the shift of attention, we really come down to how do I focus on the here and now? Our mind, coming back to our mind as our biggest storyteller, it's constantly pulling us away. I like to say it's like pressing the gas pedal and accelerating full steam ahead to what are family members going to say about my performance? What is my score going to be? What school am I going to be able to get into? What's the rest of my application process like? Or it's pushing pause really violently and saying, whoa, 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 like you never used to perform like this. You were such a good test taker in the past. You did all these problems or your past sets were not done well. Now this performance you're not going to be able to do well. And we start to make these kind of jumps between previous tests and now this present moment. And so really mindfulness focus and this kind of acceptance around the present moment is how do we stay in the here and now? And there's many different strategies we can use, but one thing I really like to challenge people to think about is can I just stop and observe? And really just become an observer of my experience and collect data, right? We don't have to judge it. We don't have to say this was good or bad performance today. What happened? Where am I sitting? What went well? What didn't? But really from the stance of like, here's what it is without this added story we add either in the future or the past.
So how do you go from observing, and
Mhm.
I think you're suggesting that's something test takers can work on just as a general practice in their life. Okay, instead of just finishing whatever it is you're doing and jumping to the next thing, take a moment, reflect. Don't try to do four things at once. How do you go
Yes.
from that to translating it into the actual ability to focus better on the
Mhm.
exam?
Yeah, no, it's such a great, and I think I would be remiss to say that it's not, it's a skill, right? So like this doesn't happen overnight. This is takes reps. Our mind, we always make this comparison. Mind is like a muscle, right? That we can think about it as we need extra reps of taking. If we're always equating whatever is going on with this storytelling, right, process or a perception that just takes us down this negative spiral, we're not actually getting to the rep we need, which is hey, this is what happened, and I move on. And so one way I like to challenge folks sitting for these exams is, can we just start to observe literally with our eyes? And I say, I want you to find 5 things while you're taking this exam and just note, what are the things you see? I see this question bolded. I see 5 answer choices. I see the next button on my screen. I see my scrap paper. And we really start to detrain this kind of response we have, is we're always jumping into that next thing. And instead, we're just starting to create that process of space between my reaction and my response to what I want to do. And I think the more we can create space for how we want to show up in some of those moments, that is actually the practice of mindfulness.
Okay, so we've thrown a lot of ideas at folks like, hey,
Yeah.
you can kind of focus on this cognitive side, you can focus on the mindfulness side, you could do some of both.
Mm-hmm.
A question we get all the time is, okay, well, maybe I've chosen a lane and I've recognized that I really need to be better at staying in the present moment. I'm going to work on it. I'm doing mindfulness practice of some sort or another, whether it's meditation and or something else. The next question we usually get is, but how long does this really take? So if you're struggling with anxiety and you're getting distracted during the test and your brain is locking up on you, and you say, right, I'm going to build mental performance skills for this exam. Is that a few weeks? Is that a few months? What does that typically look like?
Yeah. One thing I'll also say is the huge part we didn't quite also touch on is like this breath work, right? So we might be sitting and creating this space to observe and manage our thoughts, or kind of observe what's going on, but also manage our breath work and our breathing practices, our direct connection to the now. And so that's also kind of one thing I'll add here too, is that's kind of one of our biggest ways we can get back to what's important now in this moment. But coming back to like, how long does it take, right? I've seen test takers I work with do a couple reps at this with a mental performance coach or a therapist or someone of extra support, and do really well. And, they just need a couple tune-ups, as I like to say. But then I also have people working on their own, cultivating their own practice, which also goes really well for them. And they're just kind of finding some strategies in a couple weeks, and they're sitting for the exam. Usually that timeline is really tight. But then I think we can also think about this as like mental skills as life skills. So if we can create a practice here that serves you for your timeline for this exam, this translates to interviews, to once you get into one of these schools, or once the rest of your application cycle goes. So we can think about it from like a more week standpoint, but also thinking about it more holistically in the sense of like, what are the months leading up to not just this exam, but post-exam as well.
So it sounds like it's almost like any other skill, right? So if you want to become better at math or reading, at lifting weights, at playing tennis, whatever, can you get better in a week or two? Of course, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to get more better in
Yeah.
in months? Of course, right? And it's one of those. I mean, is it this? I mean, could we even say that the learning curve ever flattens out? I mean, is it something where you could just keep learning, keep getting better,
Yeah.
pretty much indefinitely, or is there an end to it? And
Yeah.
some number of months you level out.
Such a good question. The one principle that comes to mind is like this fit principle. We use it a lot in the sports space, is like the frequency, intensity, and time piece, that we are really thinking about how often am I doing this? How intense is the work I'm doing? And then over what duration am I doing it? And the consistency of that, right? So am I doing it, I'm trying one of these strategies out once a week, or am I doing it 5 times a week? And so, I think it's a great question. The leveling out, I think we can think about, there's always tweaks that can happen, but then we come back to what's the function? What am I actually working towards, of my behavior, right? So if we get to this elite, performance test taking that is really important to us, we get the score we want. How can we translate these things? And I would argue that, healthy habits are ongoing, and we can really cultivate a practice of, hey, having a really great headspace doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, or that there's an end to it. It's just, how do I keep my mind healthy just as much as I'm training the healthy habits of my body, as we see in sleep, nutrition, physical activity as well.
So I guess if somebody's listening to this and goes, okay, I want to get started, what are the 1 or 2 things that they can do right now that you'd like to see them do to start down this road and start figuring out which path and which remedies work best for them?
Yeah, I think that, while I recognize that there's so many different strategies you can get started on and you can Google or find a provider near you to go down, I really think the first step is becoming your best observer. How much can you start to recognize that your thoughts, your behaviors, and emotions are all connected? And so can we actually just take pause to recognize, to actually stop what we're doing, not in the sense of 10 minutes go by, but creating these small little micro moments of pauses that then create space for us to observe and create a choice point, right? So do I want to do something about this, or do I want to continue on the path that may or may not be serving me? And I think the more we can just create little moments of, hey, I have choice here in what I'm doing, decreases the automaticity that is not always helpful when things aren't going the way we want them, and then create more automaticity towards the things that we do want when we start to make choices that are more helpful to us, whether it's in our thinking pattern, taking a breath to actually just reset our physiology, or actually just kind of coming back to like, hey, I'm doing okay. I don't need to change anything in this moment, and maintain a sense of consistency.
Erika, thank you so much for doing this with us. That's it for this episode of the Random Guest Podcast. If you struggle with test day performance or anxiety and you got a lot out of this one, please do us a favor, hit that like button, help other people find the podcast as well. If you really enjoy Erika's approach and want to learn more about her, you can find her at erikaosherowconsulting.com or at gmatninja.com. As always, we're available on YouTube on the GMAT Club and GMAT Ninja channels, or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening or watching, and have fun studying.